As the current last game in the Silent Hill franchise, it seems like Konami knew they would be abandoning it completely 4 years ago, as the game itself caps off the infamous Month of Madness by playing like a final series finale episode of any TV drama you can think of. The game starts with something a bit different, but also shows that Konami didn't know what it was doing with this game because it allows you to build your own character right at the start, when one of the main strengths of the series is that it relates the bad thing they done did to a strong protagonist. So breaking that tradition just to give the player the choice between two characters and only a tiny amount of customization options is a frickin' red flag. For my playthrough, I decided on the bookish, shy female character, and for WayForward's credit, the personality classes they put in add a bit of bite into this quote-unquote horror game. The game starts with the character being delivered a strange tome that details all the intricate facts of her life, written up to the point she opened the book in the first place. So, of course, since this story is obviously a Death Note ripoff, the protagonist decides to start editing over things, so that stuff starts going her way in reality. And in the same wholesale theft move, the gameplay begins with a heavy Catherine feel since the entire game takes place in the protagonist's nightmares, that are supposedly the representation of the protagonist's will attempting to overtake the other persons they're changing. While the framing device has that butchered tone of the Quadrilogy games, it ends up being so weak and pushed to the sidelines that it's barely worth mentioning. Hell, WayForward gave so little of a shit about its narrative that the game itself doesn't have a subtitle option in 2012. But that's okay in a game that's 90% dungeon crawling adventure. Yeah, it's your basic proc-gen dungeon 'em up, similar to The Binding of Isaac, except not as random and decorates itself in Silent Hill flair and gore. Book of Memories certainly lives up to its title, since the aesthetic, all the monsters and storytelling elements are taken directly from past Silent Hill titles in a clip show-esque fashion where you get to be all nostalgic about the big names coming out of nowhere for no reason. But the insulting part is that the games that WayForward decided to copy were the Western developed games only, because the game puts in Butcher from Origins, the Boogeyman from Downpour, and Pyramid Head from Homecoming, along with the zombie dogs, nurses, and giant bats. The homages to the Quadrilogy games are nearly unrecognizable, and it was a clear failure to prioritize by Konami and WayForward in making a Silent Hill cash-in. And speaking of money, the decision to make the only human character in this game the mailman from Downpour was done specifically to cut costs, because there's no in-game reason why he'd be there running the weapon shop. Thankfully, WayForward didn't just make a one-note combat-only game, since that would be a pretty boring dungeon 'em up, and they added the staple ideas of item chests, treasure rooms, and story rooms that amount to a glorified QTE next to a generically scary thing completely unconnected from the dungeon or the story. And of course, what dungeon would be complete without traps? And this game's got a whole collection for the avid connoisseur. There's spike traps, bear traps, slow motion traps, and even racism traps that give enemies of a specific color a bonus when stepped on, and thankfully all of the traps even affect enemies that you can trick to activate them, since they have such boneheaded AI, and the traps do add that little bit of tension and action that dungeons need to be fun. But then there's the poison traps, and that's where WayForward took the bloody piss. These little abominations against good game design give the person who stands on it a certain status ailment that basically sins harvest the afflicted person and turns any attack into an insta-kill for like 15 seconds. And if the protagonist dies, then the whole dungeon resets to either the save point or the beginning. Combine that shitty idea with the unacceptably long load times that leave the player steaming in anger, and the fact that some levels' save points are about 20 rooms away from the start, and you get a recipe for a game-ruining addition. I hate these fucking things because they seem to exist only to pad out the game's runtime to the point where the only way to deal with them is to memorize their positions over several attempts. Oh, and here's the funny thing, you'll love this. See, while in other dungeoneering games the player activates a trap and then that trap stays activated forever, in Book of Memories the traps don't just have an infinite ability for activation, they also hide themselves again, which means that if you survive the first poisoning, just to hit it again in the middle of combat, so yeah, you die, start again, ha 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 ha. At least WayForward provides a lot of weaponry available to fight off the monsters, even if some of those monsters are royally smug nails in the ass, like the Boogeyman and his invincibility powers, and this is the one case in video gaming where having destructible weapons doesn't kill the fun, since the length of life for each weapon is fairly long, and adding in that bit of extra planning does make the combat interesting, because if it wasn't there, Book of Memories would be even more of a button basher than it already is with its one-button attack scheme. And then the game has some fun weapons, like the water sword and the flamethrower, that become extremely useful. So the wide range of weapons does make testing them out that bit of fun that it really is. The game also has RPG mechanics and item-based power-ups, but the problem with this is that you can't grind in this game, and while that's good for balancing the gameplay and difficulty, it ultimately is a failure of player expectations when given a leveling system. Then there's the other disappointment in getting the level keys. Scattered throughout every level are orb challenges where the player has to smack an orb to activate a challenge room to win a level key, which is a strange addition since these things are usually put in as optional challenges instead of hardline requirements. Most of the time the challenge is going to be kill everything in the room, obviously, but sometimes you'll get a health-based challenge where you win only if you keep yourself at a specific state of aliveness, and some of the later levels have almost dauntless challenges. But if you keep up a level of determination to beat down all the game's bullshit, you get to meet some unique bosses that'll cough up legendary weapons, some of the time, and then be able to face the ending where the game ends on a flimsy cliffhanger, where the protagonist decides to burn the book, not knowing that the book is immortal, so it'll probably curse them to death or something off screen. I literally stopped caring about that 2 levels before that happened. Book of Memories was a weird attempt by Konami to try and marry the Silent Hill narrative and aesthetic to a dungeon crawler, and then decided to wallpaper over it with old Silent Hill monsters to bank on nostalgia that it's long since burned away to nothingness. The sheer amount of stupid gameplay decisions and genre imitation just ends up making the game an unsavory mixed bag. The one-button combat and the traps and enemies make the game a slog, every level having only one save point creates a lot of backtracking, and the things added to try and call this a Silent Hill game, such as the Forsaken rooms and end-level puzzles, are as weak as the framing device backing this game up. Sure, we know that the player is trying to rewrite reality, and these levels are supposed to be representations of making those changes, but we're never told what the power of the tome actually is, so the game's frame never adds anything to the experience, and there's no payoff for beating all of its challenges. The only reason you'd play this game is for the dungeon crawling, and since that isn't fun to do, WayForward's game fails in everything it was trying to be. But if you are a proc-gen appreciator, then you'll be happy to know the game comes with an infinite dungeon mode, so you can play to level 200 if you want. Otherwise, Book of Memories is a bad Silent Hill crossover attempt that was let down by Konami's unwillingness to respect the franchise it was cashing in on, and WayForward's inexperience with the series pushed by a failed marketing test on which it took most of the burden, since it was the last game published during the month of madness. Well, at least next time we'll be playing something that's a bit less depressing for our next franchise pick, but since I'm not going to spoil that for you guys just yet, I'll just end it with a final scoreboard. And a well-deserved victory for gamers. See y'all next time.